Before making presentations, because we might make a mistake. None of us know as much as you do, so how can you make a mistake?
If you did, we
Well,
would know.
I know, but that's, but whatever I do, then I'm on scene for,
Yeah, yeah,
days, even if.
I'm better than I can do
Like,
better.
you know, if you have a great plan for something and it doesn't go exactly.
Raquel's sister is in. Shelley Rowe is her name. And
Oh.
uh-huh. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, we heard about her.
Get be curious.
I also really thought, private warrants being able to find it. I'm looking for evidence, I have a theory, I'm looking to see where the data.
There you go.
Do I
Prove your theory either being true
right or wrong?
or a little bit different than what I thought it was. Okay.
I followed this year, but I'm, no, I keep looking, publishers, which is, North Island, streets,
Oh, cool. Cool.
What you're doing in there?
Well, he's one of the people up here.
Oh,
I'm state number 9 right now, so mostly Chicago,
Mostly Chicago,
but, something.
suburb or city.
So they're just having a conversation.
I mean, North Carolina.
Thank you.
Exactly. Huh? Oh. I remember, back when banks. Stuff like that. I remember we had one of those.
Can I turn it up with this?
maybe, I don't know.
Huh?
Maybe, I don't know. Hey, there's
Yeah,
Peggy.
like cute.
Need the light on?
No,
Mute them.
Hmm?
How do I mute them?
has the program started?
It appears not.
Okay. I don't know what William's phone is doing in there. There. Now. Your audio is on.
We're gonna get a few more chairs out. What a great problem to have tonight. Too many people, not enough chairs. So thank you for coming. My name is Valerie. I'm the associate, I guess.
Okay, I'm gonna listen and wish me luck. If I get
Good luck.
pissed,
Now
I'll turn it off.
don't fiddle with anything. 'Cause you got-
And the director of education has got some gremlins speaking to us over here. People on Zoom, if you could mute, please, that would be great. Thank you so much. We've got about 47 people signed up for Zoom tonight. So this is our biggest crowd we've had, which is incredible. So thank you for coming out. If you're a member of the History Society, would you raise your hand? Fantastic. Thank you so much. Any of our programs like this are free for members, along with a lot of other benefits. If you're interested in that, please see me after the program. But for now, thank you for coming. We have a really, really great speaker tonight. I'm really excited. I tried to get Karen from the beginning, I think the first week I started here. So I'm really, really excited. I don't ever just read a bio, but I'm going to. Sorry if I embarrass my specs on. So we have with us, of course, historian Karen Sieber. She's speaking tonight on Minnesota's role in the Underground Railroad and the efforts to build a collaborative digital database and classroom resource about Black freedom seekers in the 19th century Midwest. She also will discuss a recent discovery of documentation that places noted Black abolitionist and Underground Railroad leader Moses Dickson in Minnesota during the 1850s. Despite being one of the most influential Black figures of the era, there is a gap in knowledge about his whereabouts in the 1850s, a period in which he was reportedly orchestrating and planning, but halted, a nationwide slave rebellion. Sieber will provide insight into how Dickson's story connects to both local and national Black freedom movements, and will discuss common misconceptions about the Underground Railroad. Our guest is an award-winning scholar of social justice history in the United States, often working through public history and digital history initiatives. She's best known as the creator of Visualizing the Red Summer, part of the AP African American Studies curriculum. In addition, she's appeared on television shows and documentaries like Tulsa 1921 and American Tragedy. Her research has appeared in the Minnesota History, PBS, the Smithsonian, Yahoo, MSN, in a book, Where Are the Workers? Labor Stories at the Museum and Historic Site. Her work has also been featured in the American History Association, the National History Day, National Archives, National Council for Public History, among others, for its value in the classroom. This year, bless you, this year she's also working on developing a series of documentary shorts related to America's 250th anniversary and the impact here in Minnesota. Now you see why I wanted to read that. That's a pretty impressive bio. So thank you for coming. And I'm not going to waste any time. I'm going to turn it over to our award-winning presenter. Please welcome Karen.
Well, hello, thanks so much for coming out tonight. I'm gonna see if I can sneak on the other side. Hold on. I'm here. All right. So we are here tonight to talk about the Underground Railroad here in Minnesota, which is kind of a new emerging field. For decades, we've not really known a lot about it. As my introducer mentioned, my background is not typically in this time period. So I am a historian of social justice history, but typically I tend to fall in the early 20th century, 1910 to 1930 time period. I generally specialize in riots and resistance. And so normally my period of specialization is the Red Summer and the Tulsa Massacre. So if you're familiar with me, you've probably seen me on the talking head on TV talking about that time period. Many years ago, I used to work in Galena, Illinois. If anyone's ever been to Galena, used to be a curator of the Historical Society down there.
which is where I first picked up this story of Dickson. So he's been kind of in my crosshairs for almost 10 years now, but this new research is more recent. So most of my research focuses on collecting documentation of history. So tracking down evidence from history, historic documents, court cases, news clippings, photographs, oral histories, that kind of thing. So typically, as you can see on the images of the screen, most of these are related to the Red Summer, but I also do specialize not strictly in Black history, but labor history, women's history, Native American history, looking at those stories that are often forgotten from the history books. I like to call it whole history. And so this new study for the Underground Railroad for me is, again, a new time period. And for me, it's a new world with which to dive into. I grew up in the North, but spent most of my adult life in the South. And I've been interested in the way that that slavery is talked about in different regions of the country and how much is forgotten, especially here in the North, of how much we like to tell ourselves that the North was devoid of the evils of slavery, as you'll learn a little bit tonight, that during the territorial years of Minnesota, things were not so cut and dry. So the Underground Railroad, for those that are familiar with it, different routes of freedom from the South for enslaved people to make it not just to the North, but sometimes to Mexico, sometimes to the Caribbean, sometimes even overseas, we know, when people were able to escape. So it's a complex network, but there's just in the way that it was organized, often not a lot known about it because of necessity. It wasn't something that for you, the routes would not even necessarily stay the same. And so we think of the Underground Railroad as having these direct routes and stations that were very set. And while there's some that remained the same, this was a very fluid network that would often have to change on the fly, and that often was designed to be malleable and changeable, so that regular spots could not be detected, or regular actors in certain lines would not be identified. And so it was kind of designed to be confusing. It is not necessarily a nationwide network as we think of it, where there is one person running it and everything completely, defined in a hierarchy like that. In reality, it's often these little regional networks of, a few dozen folks working together in that region. Sometimes some of those networks connect a little here and there and overlap, but for the most part, it's not quite, I think, what people envision when they think of the Underground Railroad. I think many people have this idea of slaves fleeing the South and entering the invisible North, crossing over some invisible line, and then being free. Very much not the case, especially after the expansion of the Fugitive Slave Act. There was nothing then preventing someone from coming up to Minnesota or Wisconsin or Dakota territories and bringing runaway slaves back to their slaveholders. And so this is, initially many of the spots were were in the South and helping folks just get out of the South. But really after 1850, we see this expansion of the Underground Railroad into the North and a really more developed network into some of these states, especially into what was then the Northwest, which is here in the Midwest. At one point in time, we were Iowa, we were Wisconsin, we were then Minnesota territory. And so there's this complexity of a lot of decisions that still needed to be made about statehood and about what the state stood for. There was a lot of Southerners coming up to Minnesota to settle here that had one idea about what the state should be, and other abolitionists coming from the East Coast and immigrants coming from elsewhere that also had a different opinion about abolition. I always like to start with a list of common Underground Railroad myths, and this is Henry Louis Gates' list. This is generally fairly accepted, though, by historians, that there's a lot of myths about the Underground Railroad. The first myth is that it was primarily run by white abolitionists, often Quakers. Well, we do know that there were some key Quaker leaders that were involved with it, and I was just talking to someone earlier today about a relative of Levi Coffin. And so we do know that there were Quakers involved, there were white allies involved, but for the most part, the Underground Railroad was black run. There was a book written about the Underground Railroad in the late 1800s by a man named Moses Dickson. One letter different from my last name, not the same guy. He, well-intentioned, I'm sure, but a lot of those first sites that he identified as being connected to the Underground Railroad have since been disproven. There was definitely a lot of emphasis placed on white stories of the Underground Railroad with an almost, entirely large void of stories about the Black leaders that we know that were actually the ones leading it. And so, 125, 130 years later, historians are now kind of trying to re-study these Black networks of resistance. And not to take away the allyship and the bravery that some of these Quakers and Presbyterians and other white abolitionists put forth towards the movement, but making sure that we're also upholding those stories of Black resistance. Some other myths. You hear about attics and little hidden rooms and cellars and under stairways and that kind of thing. For the most part, not how the Underground Railroad operated. So you always see, realtors that are putting in home listings that the house was, possibly a stop on the Underground Railroad because there's a little room that they found under the stairways, and it's just how houses were built during that time period. There were cellars, there were rooms. Similarly, you hear stories about underground tunnels, underground caves. Here in Minnesota, there's a lot of myths about caves being used in the Underground Railroad. For the most part, also not a thing. It was simultaneously underground and right out in the open. And so they would find ways to operate to the point where they were interacting with businesses and people and the movement of people and culture in a way that they would not be detected, at least here in the North. Freedom quilts, also, sadly, not a thing. You'll hear thousands of websites devoted to this. You'll hear people talking about it, but for the most part, it's proven. There was a book written about it in the 90s that then got picked up and shared and shared and shared, and it's now quite a common thing to hear about freedom quilts in the Underground Railroad, and it simply is not true. Great for storytelling. Great for talking about freedom stories, great for talking about sharing intergenerational stories of escape and freedom and resistance, but the quilts themselves and the patterns on the quilts were not used as any kind of secret code or message to tell people when it was okay to escape. Similarly, no evidence that some of the songs that we hear about, like Steal Away, that they were used to kind of cue people into the fact that an escape was about to happen or that something was being planned. And so there's a lot of really great myths out there that I think have value in some way, but that historians, leading with Dr. Gates, have since kind of disproven. And so what we do know, I'm going the wrong way here. Sorry, wrong arrow. That would be my problem. So the Underground Railroad in Minnesota, what we do know, the National Network to Freedom, which is coordinated with the National Park Service, designates verified Underground Railroad stories. This could include stations and stops and homes that were used, but it also can include just locations that we can connect to a freedom seeker. So maybe it's someone who escaped slavery after the war ended up here in Minnesota and was buried in a cemetery. And now we can nominate this cemetery as a site connected to the Network to Freedom. And so Minnesota has less knowledge about it than most other states. The few stories that we do know about already in Minnesota, underneath the Network to Freedom star on the screen is a stained glass window. This is Reverend Hickman. He, after the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, May of that year, with a number of other individuals that were not about to wait any longer for the troops to get there to help it along, decided that they were going to self-emancipate. And so there's a group of individuals from Missouri, came all the way up here on raft, came up to the Twin Cities, were turned around at St. Paul, not allowed access, went back down to Fort Snelling, which is just a couple miles, and got off there, but ended up settling in St. Paul, opening a church there, and really eventually starting what would be the Rondo neighborhood. And so that's one of the stories that we know, but it's also, again, after Emancipation Proclamation, and so it's not considered necessarily one of the Underground Railroad stories. It's still a freedom story. It's just not necessarily one that we can connect to a network. To the right of the stained glass window of Dr. Hickman is William Goodrich. He did not settle in Minnesota until the 1860s, but we know that before he was in Minnesota, when he was in Pennsylvania, he was a key leader in the Underground Railroad there. But we do know his daughter and her husband, Ralph and Emily Gray, were involved with the Eliza Winston case. And so we know 1860, 1861, there's activity going on in Minneapolis. And then later, around 1900, 1905, there was an article that came out, an interview with a man named Joseph Farr, and he is the sketch above the steamboat there next to the state of Minnesota. Joseph Farr and his uncle, William Taylor, we know that they were barbers in St. Paul, and Joseph Farr remembers later in his life that the barbershop was a location for freedom seekers to be funneled through. And but he didn't remember much about the time period. It was kind of a man looking back on his life at memories from 60 years earlier, was trying to remember names. And so, you know, a handful of names that are involved with this barbershop besides Farr and Taylor. James Hightower, there's Eugene Williams, there's a few other folks that we know are in St. Paul during this time period. But then there's a lot of maybes. A lot of folks that we know at the very least are allies or looking the other way or are facilitating the movement of people. And so even though we know for the most part the Underground Railroad was likely Black run in Minnesota, that it would not have been possible without some key white allies. And so there's a scholar who will be speaking here on April 10th, who's in the back of the room now, Sarah Holger, and she will be talking about some research she's doing in Southeast Minnesota with some oral histories of families down there. But she's also looking at some of the steamboat operators that were moving between Galena and Galena Dubuque area, and then up the river here to St. Paul. And similarly, there's another scholar in the room, Carol Jefferson, who's also been studying another one in the same family as Daniel Harris Smith, Warren Smith. And so we're looking at these white steamboat operators, packet shipping company, basically operators. And we know that many of the key Black Underground Railroad stewards and barbers and others that are working on the boats, we see them showing up again and again, not just here in St. Paul, but in Galena, in St. Louis, in Keokuk, Iowa, in Mineral Point. And so they're kind of all over the driftless region. And so I'm in particular interested in Moses Dickson and his wife, Mary. They're pictured on the bottom right here. Out of curiosity, anybody in the room already familiar with Moses Dickson, or within a name anyone was familiar with? Handful of people. So Moses Dickson is, maybe not one of those top 10 names that that folks know, but a very key player in Black history across numerous decades. Henry Louis Gates himself has written about Moses Dickson in the African American Encyclopedia. PBS has done specials on Moses Dickson. National Park Service has done features. He's by no means a stranger. He later opened a Black fraternal organization that had tens of thousands of members. And so typically what we do know about Dickson in terms of manual for that organization, it has kind of a bio of our founder. And it, it kind of places Dickson up on a pedestal, and it tells this wonderful story of how he came to be. But there's always been this gap in kind of how we talk about his life, or the only details that we've known are the details that he provides us with. And as I said, I like to track down that historical evidence. And so Dickson has always been kind of elusive. What we do know about his childhood, he was born in 1824, born in Cincinnati, Ohio, to Hannah, who was formerly enslaved by Robert, his father. According to Dickson, there were at least a couple of, in some respects though, and they settled in Cincinnati together with their children. And so Moses was, because his mother was free, he was born free. The family was quite influential, according to Dickson, in that kind of early free Black Cincinnati. They're involved with abolitionists, they're involved with famous AME preacher William Paul Quinn. But Cincinnati, if anyone's been to Cincinnati or can picture a map, you are right across the river from slavery. And so again, it's this place that we think of as free, and where there is this opportunity for progress and owning a home and a business and other things. There's also Black laws that are preventing anyone from educating African Americans. From, you're able to own a home, but you're not able to own land. But there's all of these restrictions and also Black codes that are restricting movement and opportunity and finances, and it's free but barely. And so Dickson is in this world in which he's very much grew up in an abolitionist mindset, but sees the evils of slavery right across the border. Ends up working as a teen on the steamboats. So he's going throughout the Ohio River Valley, but also up and down the Mississippi, working as a barber, working as a steward. A little bit about his time period here. He does at least go to school for at least a number of years. We think that this time period coincides with when Cincinnati is having a series of race riots every 3 years for a decade. It's a city of unrest. And so he leaves Cincinnati in his teens and ends up traveling throughout the South and eventually to the North on steamboats as a way to not only gain employment, but also get out and see the rest of the world. But again, most of these details can't be supported. And so I pride myself in being able to track down documentation of anything. And there's no records of a free family with those names. There's no record of he said him and all of his siblings were baptized by Reverend Quinn at a church in Cincinnati. There's no records of that. There's no emancipation records that match his mother's name. And so there is also the possibility that he is a fugitive slave himself. And that this story is created as a cover story. Or that he is a free Black still. But that the story is still a cover story because of the way that he's operating and the work that he's doing. And so his childhood, not much known about it. We do start to have Dickson showing up in the records though in the 1840s, late 1840s. We know that he starts a secret abolitionist organization called the 12 Knights of Tabor. Records vary, sometimes it's 46, sometimes it's 48. But we know that the folks that he's leading that organization with are many key Black players from the Black freedom. both before the war and after the war. Alfred H. Richardson, Edwin Kane, William Emery, Garrett Johnson. So these are some big figures in that kind of mid-19th century time period. He starts a second secret abolitionist organization, the Knights of Liberty, and they are reportedly planning to organize 50,000 individuals from across the United States for a massive slave uprising that was supposed to happen 10 years later. So they were going to organize, disperse into different parts of the country, train these smaller militias to then collectively have an uprising. The same time period, late 1840s, he marries a widow named Mary Elizabeth Butcher. She is considered a mulatto woman from Missouri, free Black family who had been marrying in with French traders. And so it's, and her family is very close to Governor Dodge and his family and his slaves. And so the same time period that Governor Dodge is coming up from Missouri to then Galena to then Wisconsin, it's a lot of these same families that we see interacting with each other decade after decade. So they show up in Galena by late 1840s. They're opening a confectionery shop there. And so Mary, even before she marries Moses, as a free Black woman, single woman, running her own business successfully in Galena, which is a boom town at the time. And then we know that Moses is working on the steamship Nominee, and he's going up and down the river and also working alongside some folks that we see with him again up here in Minnesota. And so Joseph Farr and William Taylor, those stories that we have been able to verify here in Minnesota, he's with all of them in Galena as well. And so it's these networks of folks that are moving together, establishing communities in cities up and down the river. I also just recently found Dickson. He's very briefly in 1950 living with an abolitionist family in New York, quite a well-to-do abolitionist family that is known to be organizing people kind of all throughout the Syracuse region. And so Dickson is living with their, doing God knows what, but living with this family that we know is quite connected. And so it's one line of possibilities we're looking into here. But otherwise, Dickson disappears from the records, typically as the story that has been told about Dickson's life. Typically, he disappears from the records 1849, 1850, and then doesn't show up again until the Civil War. And so for 100 years, the bios of his life talk about him organizing this underground secret society, this planned slave rebellion, and then it just glosses it over like it's nothing, to skip it over, and then it's all of a sudden a Civil War. And historians have just never known what happened to Dickson during this time period. And it turns out, and so what he says, first of all, again, because we have Dickson's account of what happened versus what the records show. And so Dickson says that in the 1840s that he's traveling throughout the South. He claims that he helps William Box Brown escape. If you're familiar with the William Box Brown story, it's a man who mails himself to freedom. So Dickson says that he's involved with that story. He claims that he's involved with John Brown when John Brown's in Iowa before heading east. And so it's a lot of grand claims, but again, no documentation to back it up. And so I've been studying Dickson about 10 years, starting in Galena. And like everyone else, he disappears from the record, and I just dropped it at one point because I hit every brick wall that I could hit trying to find him. 10 years later, this past year, picked up his story again. And he's not in the South, but he's a mile outside of my door from where I live in St. Paul, right down the river. And so I actually first found his wife, Mary, in the records. Whenever I can't find one family member, I'll try to follow another one for a while. And so I find Mary in the records first. It's kind of hard to read here, but they have her name listed as Dixen. So I think that was part of the problem with not being able to find it initially. His name is not spelled out fully, but just listed as M. Dickson here. So there was also then some cross triangulation to make sure that this was indeed the Moses Dickson that I was looking for and not just someone with a similar name. And so we have Moses and his wife Mary living here. This is territorial records from 57. Right underneath them on the line, there's an E. Williams, and we also know that there's another man named Eugene Williams, another free Black individual who is also working on the steamboats, leading people to freedom. And so we have Eugene Williams living right next to Moses Dickson here in St. Paul. And so once I found him there in 57, then knowing that he was there, was able to go back and really kind of turn over every stone to look for other instances of him in the city. And so it turns out Dickson opened an eating saloon, a restaurant basically, in 1853. It was opened through 1854. It changed names briefly. He separated from a business owner. But we know that he is likely the first Black business owner in town, if not the first, one of the first one or two. He's serving primarily white clients, but also we found some instances of African Americans also eating here, and so it's territorial years are often not quite as segregated as we see later on in cities. The cities are very small still at this time period. There's less than 4 dozen African American individuals in town to begin with. And so Moses Dickson was not living under the radar as thought, but very much living out in the open. Business owner, living around the corner from the governor, very, not living under the radar as we thought. And so in 1853, 1854, he was involved with the famous court case in territorial St. Paul. He was attacked in his restaurant. The man who attacked him was sent to jail, but the man who attacked him happened to be friends with the territorial governor. And after he was put in jail, the governor let the guy out. And the all-white jury ends up writing a letter to the newspaper in support of Moses Dickson, angry that the governor has let this man out of jail, even though the jury had voted to convict him. And so there's a series of court cases about Dickson and this other man. And so again, constantly in the news and definitely a known figure among town. But the restaurant is short-lived. 1850s are kind of a tumultuous time. There's a number of different economic depressions happening. There's kind of the ups and downs of boomtown life and a river that freezes for half of the year and a town that is kind of living and dying by the navigation of the river. And so when he's not working on the steamboats, we know that he's back to barbering. And so in 1856-57, he's at the Winslow House Hotel, moves to the Fuller House Hotel in 58-59. We also know that he's the first teacher for African American students in town, before there's an official designation or funds or anything from the city. And so this is neighborhood community run that they needed a solution. And Minnesota pre-territorial years are one thing, but like many other states, there's often laws against teaching enslaved African Americans, free African Americans. And so many states and cities were not appropriating money to support African American students still at this time, not until after the war at least. We also know, I've been at Howard University this past week in their archives looking into some papers and diaries of the Rapier family, which is a noted family and a Reconstruction era politician. Was quite connected to the free community that was established in Buxton, Ontario. And so John Rapier Jr. Is living with Dickson at the time, working at the barber shop with him. And we know that they're writing letters back and forth with these individuals in Buxton as well as places stateside as well. And so there's a number of different individuals that we know are connected to freedom seeking that show up in Rapier's diary and in his log of letters back and forth. Dickson himself is a prolific letter writer during this time period. He writes letters to the editor, not just about anything. He is calling people out and not afraid to do so. And so during the Dred Scott case and during some local state cases that are related to whether or not African Americans can own land or be allowed to homestead, he writes this letter here to the Minnesota Weekly Times, asking, I cannot help asking you if you have ever read a genuine copy of the American Declaration of Independence. In what have I offended that this injustice should be heaped upon me and mine? Is it because I love my country less than you? No. For you have all the advantages of education and refinement that society can furnish and are eligible to any office as the gift of the people. Your affection for your native land is only enough to put her in chains. While I, though depressed and downtrodden by my country ever since I saw the light of day, loves her still. What kind of institution is a Negro? Who am I? I'm not an alien, for I was born on American soil. I'm not a citizen, for you and your subordinates, the five slaveholders, say I am not. I am a thing. I live, breathe, eat, work, drink, die, and if I have a soul, does it go before the eternal judge? Or does the Supreme Court take care of that for me too? Yours, an alien American. So I'm working right now to get this letter in every single classroom I can. This is not a man living under the radar for the 10th time. This is someone who is not afraid. He's typically known as kind of a militant abolitionist, but to be able to find the paper trail and record of it is fantastic. And so he's right here calling out, when he's talking about the 5 slaveholders, he's referring to the Supreme Court justices, who at the time, 5 of them either owned slaves or previously owned slaves or inherited slaves. He also, in a later excerpt of the same letter, is calling out T.M. Fullerton, who's both a reverend here in territorial Minnesota, but also in charge of homestead land rights and things. And so he's very much calling out white leaders. But 1857 here is also when he's supposed to be leading this national slave rebellion. And so the 10 years that he's supposed to be organizing folks, and it's supposed to be happening the summer after he's writing this letter, he would have been in Minnesota. And so if the story is to be believed that he is organizing this mass rebellion, that we know that organizing is happening from right here in Minnesota. Or maybe the slave rebellion maybe it's not 57,000, maybe it's a couple hundred, maybe, so there's a lot of uncertainty still about what, for an event that never came to be, it's hard to understand exactly how big it would have been, how much of a reach it would have had. But we know that it's all during this time period. But by the next year, Dred Scott decision has happened. African American land rights are no longer a possibility in 57, 58, 59. We know that the halted slave insurrection never happens. And so kind of understanding what does it mean that we're finding Dickson here with all of these other individuals that we know are operating on the Underground Railroad. You find one, maybe it's something, you find 2, okay, that's a coincidence. And after you get 3, 4, 5, it's starting to, at least the argument for more time and energy to be spent on these stories and to look at these networks, and to better understand how all of these pieces fit together. So after the war, right before the war, 1860, he ends up back in St. Louis. His daughter is born in 1860. He also in that year signs what's called a free Negro bond. So even free African Americans, their movements were still restricted, and they would often have to sign an agreement with a white citizen in town who would basically vouch for them, and both men would put forth money towards this bond. And so if Moses did leave the state of Missouri or run away, that this other man who signed the bond with him would then also be responsible. And so the man that signs the bond for him is the former mayor of St. Louis. We also know that Dickson is connected to Dred Scott's owners. So there's a lot of complexity here about his time back in Missouri that also kind of highlights the likelihood that perhaps he was a fugitive slave and that perhaps he was not born free, as his story says. He's involved with the U.S. colored troops. He is quite involved with the Freedmen's Bureau, and so throughout the war and soon after, he's an integral person to be opening schools, to be able to help people find employment, to open churches, that he's still an organizer, even after emancipation has come. And so he opens a number of AME churches throughout the South and the Midwest. A number of these churches, within a week or two of being built, were then burned down by the KKK, which is something that we see a lot, especially in Missouri at the time, but also in some other southern states. New churches, new schools were often immediately met with resistance. Dickson's home is also burned down during this time period. But there's also signs of progress. So he opens the HBCU Lincoln University during this time period. He's putting a lot of money and effort and organizing into the betterment of his community. He's also quite active with the Prince Hall Masons. For those of you unfamiliar with Prince Hall, he lived during the Revolutionary time period in Boston and Philadelphia. He saw that the networks and the possibilities that existed for white leaders within Masonry and started, but African Americans were not allowed to be members of the white Masonry groups, and so he started his own Masonry group called the Prince Hall Masons. They've now been in existence for almost 250 years. And name a key civil rights figure in history, and I can guarantee you that they were a Prince Hall Mason. Du Bois and Washington, both Prince Hall Masons. Thurgood Marshall, Martin Luther King, A. Philip Randolph. So it was seen as this Black organizing, an opportunity to gather with other key leaders and politicians and business owners and educators, and to be able to, I think, especially in these years after the Civil War, these Black Masonry halls that were opening up in Black communities around the Midwest really helped communities grow in that first wave of the Great Migration, especially. And Dickson's also still involved with politics himself, and so he's a Reconstruction era politician. He is a delegate at every single state convention in Missouri for like 15 years. He's an elector at large for Ulysses S. Grant. He starts the Missouri Missouri Equal Rights League. He also is named consul for the Seychelles. He's involved with a number of folks in Liberia and other kind of back to Africa movements. So he's quite connected, not just as a business owner, not just as an AME preacher, as an educator, as a politician, as a U.S. colored troop soldier. He is in every single aspect of Black life. He has his fingers in. And I mentioned earlier, one of the secret abolitionist societies that he started before the war ended up turning into a more official version of it after the war. So the Knights of Tabor, or the International Order of 12, as it was known, started in 1872. It was important for a number of reasons, burial benefits and assistance and a lot of benefits for members, but also a lot of opportunities for women to hold leadership roles. It adopted a lot of its ceremonial details from kind of the masonry world, and so there's a lot of overlap between this fraternal organization and the Principal Masons. And at their height, they had over 100,000 members, nearly every state, as well as a number of other countries. This was second largest African-American fraternal organization during its era. So Dickson, again, after the war, was even a better name than before the war. He was also one of the key individuals in the Exodus movement. And so, you know, a short generation after the Civil War, with economic reasons and environmental reasons and labor and all of these African Americans who had stayed in the South, sharecropping and working other jobs, quickly realized that the system was still completely set up against them. Encountering environmental issues and bad crops and bad prices for a few years. And by the time we hit late 1870s, there's a mass exodus out of the South, leading to Midwest cities, leading to the Plains State. So big population booms happening in Omaha, Tulsa, Minneapolis, Chicago. All of these folks are coming up the river, the river meeting in St. Louis. And Dickson and one other individual are the two leaders that are kind of helping facilitate all of this movement of people and helping people find new homes, new jobs, ways to good places, ways to connect with family members elsewhere. And he, along with John Milton Turner, one of the people, not just organizing folks, but also fundraising nationwide with others that they bring in funds to support. So Moses' wife dies in 1891. He still is alive for another 10 years. There has always, like him, she has always kind of been placed up on a pedestal. She was kind of the female head of this organization. Always called Mother Dickson, and she was the well, it turns out there was a second midwife too that nobody's ever known about, and so in all of the tellings of Dickson's life before, they never mentioned this second wife. So he marries her in 95. They're separated a year and a half later, divorced shortly after that. She's 40 years younger than him, and there was claims of spousal abuse, her abusing him. He was in his 70s or 80s at the time. So it's a short-lived marriage, not often talked about. The only records I could find related to it were in the German language newspaper in Missouri. So don't discount the foreign language newspapers if you're searching for historic details. But that is, for now, all we know about Dickson. And so what I'm trying to do is to better understand those networks. How does he connect to Taylor and Barr? How does he connect to the folks in Winona? How does he connect to folks in Dubuque and Galena? And so I'm building out a massive database on the back end of names and dates and places to be able to track the movements of these people. And to be able to coordinate with other historians in other parts of the state, as well as in Iowa, in the UP, in Wisconsin, elsewhere, so that we can all look at the same names and dates and places and say, oh, I wonder if your Jones family is my Jones family. I wonder if your Jeffrey family is my Jeffrey family. And so, this is not a static time period. People are in one place for a handful of years and they move on to somewhere else. And so this is a very fluid time period. And so just looking at kind of one snapshot in time doesn't quite give you the full picture of how all of these stories fit together. And so I'm looking at Dickson and his network, not only here in territorial St. Paul, but a generation before and a generation after, because some of these people are previously enslaved together. Some of these people, a generation later, their children are intermarrying and they're settling in Dubuque and Chicago and elsewhere around the Midwest. And so just better understanding the complexity of the Black Freedom Network at the time, as well as the resilience. Where do these families end up? Where do these communities grow? Where are Black businesses opening? Where are other Prince Hall Mason temples opening? So we know Dickson returns to St. Paul in 1866 to open the temple there in St. Paul. And so just better understanding the complexity of all of this. And so I'm looking for historical data right now, putting together lists of every single Black barber I can find in the Midwest, every single AME preacher I can find, every single Black landowner. And so hoping that by doing so, can better understand not just where these people are settling, but also to better understand some networks. So up on the map here, we do know that there's a little bit of activity coming up the Mississippi River. And we do know there's some going through the lakes and a lot of traffic going through Detroit. But I'm starting to talk with some individuals that are some free Black families that they're looking into in upstate Wisconsin, in the Upper Peninsula, further north in Minnesota. And so for 100 years, we've thought that through 1860 or so, that St. Paul was kind of it. You got that far on a boat and that was kind of the edge of wilderness. There was a little bit of other things happening, tiny little communities and offshoots, but for the most part, it was assumed that if there was freedom seeking going on, or if there was any activity on the Underground Railroad, that it would have stopped there. And that people would have been actually brought in back down the river to Galena, and then east to Chicago and east to Detroit and over to Windsor, and that it was kind of like if the opportunity arose and that someone was able to free themselves in the north, that then they would go back down these already established routes. But I'm kind of figuring there might be some other routes up there. And so I'm looking at military roads, territorial roads, Indian trading paths, other waterways, native communities. We know that some of the native communities are intermarrying with fugitive slaves that have kind of settled in the wilderness as well. And so trying to better understand the complexity of this area, which was kind of the edge of the wilderness at the time. And so ideally, not just identifying where some of these gaps and inconsistencies and stories are, but ideally getting some more sites nominated on that Freedom Map, getting more curriculum out there for teachers, to be able to talk more about the complexity of race in Minnesota during that time period. And again, to bring resources together. So to give teachers and the general public all of the tools and resources they need to study their areas themselves or to better understand this time period. And so that's kind of where I'm at right now. This work is supported right now, Minnesota Humanities Center, Minnesota Historical Society, State Historical Society of Iowa. Those are the three key folks supporting this initiative right now. But trying to collaborate with scholars in other states too, to triangulate all of our research and collaboratively try to better understand this, this complex network of individuals. Any questions? It's a lot of information in a short bit. I don't know what kind of time period we're looking at here.
Yep, 10 minutes or more, so go ahead and ask.
I wonder if you could say something about how you've done the research. My suspicion is you've depended a lot on Google and the internet to find these really obscure things by searching his name and all sorts of other things that you're curious about, then they lead you down paths. And maybe in addition to saying what you're doing now, say how impossible it would have been to do it 25 years ago.
Mhm. Yeah, I always have a variety of angles of attack for any kind of research that I'm doing, and so I do spend a lot of time online. I work, I teach archival management and I work in digitization of history and metadata, if there's any digital or metadata people out there, but I know all the tricks and tools to be able to track stuff down on the internet, but also less than 10% of historical documents out there have been digitized. And so I think it's so easy for ourselves to say, oh, well, I looked for it, or I did a search on Ancestry, or I did a Google, and I didn't come across anything, so there must not be anything out there. And I swore that I looked at all these same keywords and tried all of the various spelling variations of Dickson that I could come across 7, 8 years ago, and I didn't come across anything of him in Minnesota. Searching again this year, and I think it's simply that there's been more documents scanned. OCR has gotten better at reading handwriting and cursive. But I still, every single week, am in the archives, looking at microfilm, going through boxes, going through folders, going through files. As I mentioned last week, I'm at Howard University reading line by line someone's diary, and so well, digital sources are great, and there's nothing really like getting into the archives and looking at the historical documentation. So many options. I wasn't sure who's first.
You want me to go back to my teaching days?
Well, I got 4 different ones here, and I wasn't sure. Okay.
Next to Dr. Scanner, Dr. Scanlon.
And I point out that it's shown there is actually identical to the trail.
Yeah, without a doubt. Even though my focus is mostly on the river, I'm not ignoring the trail by any means, because we do know that one of the folks in St. Paul, who is an ally in the hiding folks, is the Willoughby and Powers transportation company, and so it's an overland transportation company, and so I think there's a few different stories that we know are more connected to Stagecoach and other things, and so definitely not ignoring those overland routes too. Oh, through Rochester here too.
I'm just curious about when you talk about these myths. You know, so many times you read that somebody proves this isn't right, but then 5 years later, somebody else proves it's right. So how do you know what he comes up with these myths that they're not true?
Yeah. Well, like the quilt one, for instance. So one, there's been hundreds of slave narratives done. There was interviews, WPA interviews that were done decades later with formerly enslaved individuals. We know that there's been some memoirs and things of folks that were involved with the Underground Railroad. Not a single one of them talk about quilts, which is and the first instance that it was written about was in the 90s. And that author later admitted that she was basing all of it on one single oral history. And that oral history was pretty recent. So there's, 100 years of the story not being told, and all of a sudden the story is being told with no connectors in between. But for that one, it's actually quilt historians who were able to provide some insight there. And so they were able to show that some of these patterns that had been associated with freedom quilts and as stories that were meant to represent an escape about to happen, or this, each design meant something, was supposed to mean something else. They were able to show that some of those patterns were so widely used and so prevalent in quilts at the time that you wouldn't have been able to, if there was a quilt hanging on somebody's clothesline, you wouldn't have been able to tell if they were a friend or a foe. That it was the quilt patterns that they were claiming were being used were so prevalent that it would have been like every third quilt would have had that pattern on it. And so we see a lot of things like that. In New England, there's a rumor of the tops of chimneys being painted in white, and that was somehow a clue for underground railroad. And they've been able to show that at street level, if you were looking at houses, you wouldn't have even been able to tell which house had that on top. And so there's little archaeologists and paper trails and oral histories and other things kind of all triangulating to help us figure out what's likely true and what isn't.
A lot of it's just opinion.
Yeah.
Young lady with the mask. We're entering into what I hope will be a short time period of this not being welcome in classrooms. And how will you navigate or continue to move this important, these important stories and this important data into areas that where it will be literally banned? And I don't know what kind of roadblock or hurdle that puts up in front of you and your access to research as well.
Yeah. And it's hard to say, because it's all at this point, just kind of imagining what will be. My other research about race riots and lynchings is part of the AP African American Studies curriculum nationwide right now. And I know that it was that my research in particular was one of the key points of contention in Florida and Texas, because I show images of lynching and other things on the website. And so I've already kind of been dealing with it for a few years, and I'm happy to say that every single week I have teachers from Florida and Texas logging in to share it. And so I think often there's the rules and regulations that exist on paper, and I think there's always still going to be educators and community activists and even if, you know, everyone can be an ally in their own way. And so if you are seeing this kind of curriculum being removed from your schools, finding other ways of getting it into the hands of students and teachers and others that need access to it. I live in a world of public history, but I specifically self-fund all of my work. And so all of my websites, I host myself, I fund myself. I get by doing events and consulting and other things. But because of that, it allows me some freedom that there's no one to tell me to take the website down, or no funding that's going to be removed, that it's meant to exist as something independent from an institution that's going to have you know, political interests and concerns about funding and that kind of thing. Oh, sorry about that.
I've been researching Black History here,
You know, Yep, the Bongo family is in my circle, and I'm actually looking at a couple settlers who are, so it's always thought that Bongo was the first African American resident of the Twin Cities, and he was involved with some trading and other things. But as I said, I think we know that a lot of the fugitive slave families are intermarrying with these Native families and Ojibwe families in particular. And so there's a few individuals that we know, these communities that are starving. And so yeah, I think likely there are some inland roots, and I think some of those families are key to better understanding that. over here. A ton of time here in the building, so you might need to make some other arrangements, as the building will be close shortly after we wrap up
You're
here.
welcome to get my email from Sarah. I'm happy to connect with you, and I'm sure I'll be down to Winona soon too, and we can even sit and go over stuff down there.
Did you have a question when you're Grace? In your research of Moses Dickson, have you run across Alexander Clark, who was in Iowa?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah, exactly. So Alexander Clark and Moses Dickson were trained by the same black barber in Cincinnati, William Darnes, who was actually Alexander Clark's uncle. And so they both trained barbering under Darnes in Cincinnati, and then Alexander Clark ended up in Iowa. Clark famously had a lawsuit against the state of Iowa to give his daughter equal education opportunities. So I think his lawsuit was 1866, maybe, but it was early. When we think of school integration lawsuits, Clark's was one of the earliest. But he was, yeah, also very key in Prince Hall Masons. Clark was the head of the Iowa jurisdiction, but it also happened to be, I think, Kansas and Missouri and a few others. But Clark is kind of, I'm looking at Dickson's networks in kind of concentric circles. And so Clark, I'm considering in that kind of inner circle of a handful of individuals. Because we know that they're connected for at least, a few decades of their life. Dickson only had one child. Mhm. There's two other African American Dickson people who live in Minnesota. Whether or not they're family members, I've not been able to document anything. Neither say that they were born in Ohio like Dickson was, but again, if we're unsure about Dickson's own origin stories, that might not mean anything. But there's a William Dickson and two Dicksons that I have. There's also one other Dickson in Galena that I'm looking into. And then one of Dickson's key, one of the people he started the secret organization with was a man named Henry Christopher. And I think the name Henry Christopher might also be fake because the leader of the Haitian Revolution was Henri Christopher. And so I think it's just him adopting this name. But Henry Christopher, one of the other men he runs this organization with, his wife's maiden name is Dickson, Corinda Dickson. And because of how long that family stays connected, I've kind of assumed that Corinda is one of Dickson's siblings or cousin or someone else.
any other questions before we kind of wrap up this evening?
Thank you for coming. I just want to say that when I showed up tonight, it was primarily because I don't want events. I'm an educator. I don't want events like this to go away. And I thought we need to make sure that she has an audience. And then I got here and there was no parking left. So wonderful. We have to support these events so they do go away. I was wondering if you read Colson Whitehead's Underground Railroad. I'm interested as an educator and an English professor thinking about assigning that book in addition to documentaries, nonfiction texts, and other things about the time period. What's your opinion on that book?
Yeah.
And its historical accuracy.
It's hard.
It's so built on history and it's such a great book from a literary perspective. I do know from other folks that have taught it that there still tends to be so many people that are taking it literally and that think that there's an actual Underground Railroad and the book is not doing it any justice. I don't know if you know about the book, but it's literally built on, and I think it tends to be confusing for students. That being said, I think there's still value there. I think there's a lot of options still out there. And so for those that are interested, I'll go back.
Yep.
I'll put it up. Let's see here. All right, so ksieber.com, their
there's a link to contact me, so if anybody does want to talk further, you can find me on the web there. And then all of the initial research about Dickson, as well as all the historical documentation to back up that story, is all on findingmoses.org. There are placeholders on the website right now for additional people and additional places. So within the next 6 months, I hope that that interactive database that I'm building will actually be an interactive map and an interactive timeline, so you can actually see in real time how these people are moving and settling across the Midwest. And there's also the start of some resources and other things linked on the website. And so educators especially, stay tuned. And by summer or so, there should be curriculum and other things, companion information for the website. Thank you again for coming out. Thank you to Karen. Just a reminder, as she mentioned, we do have on April 10th, Sarah Grover will be in with another telling about the Underground Railroad, more specifically in southeastern Minnesota. So that's April 10th. So go ahead and mark your calendars now. And if you like lectures like this, I appreciate the shout out. We try to do our best to tell history that sometimes isn't always told. Check out our website. We do Thursday evening lectures. We have a lot coming up, a lot of fun stuff coming up. Amy Hahn, a local author, is coming up during Women's History Month to talk about the women of Olmsted County and Rochester. So please keep going to the website. We really, really appreciate you coming. You are what keeps us open. So thank you very much. The information to contact Karen Sieber is on the screen. If you would like to do that, I think she'd be okay with that. So thank you for coming. Drive safely. Thanks a lot.
That was so good.
feel like I just get verbal diarrhea and then I'm like.
Oh my God, no, it was fascinating.
Absolutely fantastic. I'm very spy. I do medical history and I've did lots of oral history. Some of the comments I'm sure you would say too. If you have documents, and you know, find what's means in geek or something. It describes it, but it's fascinating how they sort of influence themselves up and so. She's a quote. She's read the book. She's read the book that you're talking about.
Yeah, that was last year.
Sister says. Oh my God. Oh, it's almost like I was flexible.